I'm Dominic Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Poland reports sabotage on rail infrastructure linking the country to Ukraine, and Romania has to evacuate people after Russian strikes across the Danube River, we report on President Zelensky's weekend diplomatic efforts that has seen an energy deal with Greece and an agreement with France for 100 fighter jets. And later, we have an interview with Vladimir Kara-Murza, the Russian-British political activist and journalist known for his pro-democracy work.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody is going to break us. We are strong. We are Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 17th of November, 3 years and 268 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's executive editor for audio, Francis Dearnley, and Europe editor, James Crisp. I started with the latest military updates from Ukraine. So I'll go chronologically as far as I can with some headlines in a moment, but let's do the bluff, the bottom line up front. Let's give you the big military headlines from over the weekend. Zoom in on the military down on the ground. It looks like Russia has reverted to trying to encircle Pokrovsk in the Donbass. The rate of advance internally in the city there, and Minarad, about 5 km to the east, seems to have slowed. Now, reports suggest a number of mechanised assaults, so in vehicles basically, have failed. An urban environment, especially one that's been smashed up. Urban areas are always very difficult terrain for vehicles. There are too many hiding places for soldiers to hit them from with anti-tank stuff and ways of sneaking around to make sure that those hits land on the most vulnerable parts of the vehicle, which is generally the top and the rear of the vehicle. So very, very difficult and dangerous using armoured or mechanised forces inside an urban terrain. Now, the spokesperson of the Ukrainian brigade operating in the Pokrovsk area said yesterday that Russian forces have reverted to conducting infiltrations in small infantry groups of 2 to 3 people instead of mechanised assaults. That's likely a reaction to the failure of using vehicles in the last couple of weeks. Now, even that, reported to be sort of groups of 2 or 3 people, is down from the 5 to 10 so-called infiltration assaults that we've seen in recent weeks. The infiltration assault is a fancy term basically for just running forwards, hoping you don't get killed. So it's not particularly sophisticated, but the numbers do seem to be much lower than recently. Now, a Ukrainian fighter operating in the neighbouring Konstantinivka-Druzhkivka area, that's about 40 km northeast up near Bakhmut, told CNN on Sunday that the size of Russian infiltration groups there has also recently dropped from between 5 to 7 Russian soldiers to a maximum of 3, the individual was saying. Speaks of a personnel shortage of the front line. I don't think it speaks of a desire by Russia to limit the casualties, because we know that's not how they operate. Now, the Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, says that this failure of mechanised assaults to rapidly bring large numbers of Russian forces into Pokrovsk and the costly nature of this type of infiltration-based troop accumulation may constrain Russian forces' ability to reinforce within Pokrovsk and delay Russian forces' seizure of the town. Now then, move to the southwest from Pokrovsk, and in that Russian push that we've been reporting on that really started in earnest last week down in the kind of Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk area, this is after weeks of depth strikes to diminish and degrade Ukraine's ability to operate in the area. Russia continues small advances west there. Ukrainian Southern Defence Forces spokesperson Colonel Vladislav Voloshin, speaking on Saturday, said that recent Russian advances threatened to cut off the town of Hulyapol that we spoke of last week from what's called GLOC. You'll see this phrase GLOC. GLOC means ground lines of communication, basically logistic routes on road and rail. And in particular, the T0401 highway that runs north to south in the area through the town of Hulyapol, that is not held by Russia. It's not even under fire control, i.e. they can directly see it and bring accurate fire down, but they will be able to hit it with ranged fire, mortars, artillery, that kind of thing. Now then, to the northeast in the country, Ukraine seems to be successfully pushing back Russian forces from Kupiansk. Ukraine's Joint Forces Task Force said yesterday that Ukrainian troops control Kupiansk and have cut off Russian forces in the north from ground-based logistic resupply. There are some suggestions. Russian supplies are now being dropped by drone with Russian flags attached to them. We've seen some footage then released by Russia purportedly claiming that Russia holds that piece of land because there's a flag on it and we can geolocate it, when in reality it's actually a number of cut-off and hungry soldiers being supplied by drones with a flag. Russian MOD said on Sunday that Ukraine had counterattacked to the north and the south of the main town of Kupiansk. Right, let's scoot over some of the main events of the weekend chronologically. So back to Friday, after we were last speaking to you. So in Voronezh, in the area of the Chemical Automatics Design Bureau, one of the main centres of Russian rocket engineering, a lot of rocket engines tested there inside Russia, there was a huge fire. Don't know what caused it. Don't know if it was a Ukrainian strike or if it was anything that happened internally, but there was a huge fire there in Voronezh. Then on Friday night, now after a tough week for Ukraine on the back of tough months and years, but after another particularly tough week for Ukraine and those overnight strikes, was it Thursday, Friday, and that massive aerial attack, I think 528 aerial munitions used, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres tweeted. He said, "I strongly condemn Russia's large-scale missile and drone strikes on several Ukrainian regions. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are unacceptable and must end immediately. I reiterate my call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire as a first step towards a just, comprehensive and sustainable peace that fully upholds Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity." He then convened an emergency UN Security Council meeting where... Oh, hang on. No, he didn't. No. He just put that tweet out. Well, thanks. Okay, it's good to know. Thanks, Antonio. Now then, also on Friday night, the Ukrainian military said it had shot down 93 of 138 Russian air targets, 2 of 3 Kh-47M2 Kinzhal ballistic missiles and 91 of 135 drones. No tweet on Saturday from Mr. Guterres, but I guess he's busy. Now, on Saturday, our friend and colleague, freelance journalist Anna Conkling, she's been on the podcast before, hoping to speak to her a little bit later this week. She's back in Ukraine. She was in Kramatorsk in the east of the country. In Kramatorsk, back end of last week, this was on Saturday, she said there was no electricity there for more than 24 hours. In a terrible story, she said she went to a market on Saturday to speak with residents, and she says there was a group of people standing behind police tape and a destroyed ambulance. So she went and had a chat with the police there, and they told her that around 2 hours before she got there, a medic had bought a power bank from a chap at the market, and when the medic got back to his vehicle and used it, it exploded and killed him. Now, people at the market said the guy who sold him the power bank had just got it out of a pile of rubbish, that people are looking for any way to survive, make money. The police reportedly arrested the seller, but let him go a few hours later, saying it wasn't his fault. Some local people said they think pro-Russian collaborators had planted the power bank in the rubbish. Now, we don't know that, we can't verify it, but what we do know is that somebody died in the incident where Anna was very shortly after. And against the backdrop of the ongoing energy scandal, it shows how desperate people are for electricity and money. Like I said, we hope to speak to Anna later in the week. Now then, overnight yesterday, Sunday and last night, Ombre Intelligence, the global maritime risk management firm, has reported several merchant vessels have been damaged as a result of a large Russian drone attack on the port of Ismail in Ukraine, down in the southwest of Ukraine. Ombre has observed imagery confirming at least 2 ships were hit. A bulk carrier likely suffered a direct impact from a drone strike to its starboard side hull, and cargo holds with 1 cargo hatch charred and dislodged from its track, they say. A gas tanker was also set ablaze. Port infrastructure similarly damaged. 1 casualty so far reported. Then in an update just about an hour ago, Ombre says they've received information that a Turkish-flagged gas carrier damaged during that attack continues to pose a threat to life due to an ongoing fire on board the vessel. And connected to that, directly connected, Romanian authorities have evacuated residents from the village of Plaru in Romania. That's just across the Danube River from that ship's position. Now, in the middle of last night, Russia hit a residential area, the town of Balaklia in the Kharkiv region, with 2 ballistic missiles. This is about 50 km southeast of Kharkiv city. 3 people died there, 13 injured. Also overnight across the country, 128 drones were fired by Russia, 91 being brought down by Ukraine. Also on Sunday, the Ukrainian Zaporizhia Oblast Prosecutor's Office said it's opened an investigation into the latest alleged execution of Ukrainian prisoners of war. So these 3 individuals were said to have been killed in the vicinity of Huliopol on Friday by Russian forces. A source reportedly affiliated with Ukrainian military intelligence posted footage over the weekend showing Russian troops murdering 2 surrendering Ukrainian prisoners of war on the outskirts of Zatishaya, that's just to the east. Now, possibly connected to that, a story back in from the ISW. They say Alexei Milshakov, who's the leader of Russia's far-right paramilitary unit, the Russich Sabotage Assault Reconnaissance Group, he amplified photos of an execution of 3 Ukrainian prisoners of war alleged to have happened on Saturday. So I'm not sure if that was the same incident that was previously reported as Friday. Sounds similar. So he posted the footage of these alleged executions and claimed he would offer cash prizes to the first 3 people who submit a photo with, quote, clearly executed prisoners in the background. Now, Milshakov is both the leader of that Russian paramilitary unit and a prominent voice in the Russian mill blogger circuit. His calls to commit war crimes against Ukrainian service personnel reflect Russian forces' widely accepted cultural and systemic practice of committing war crimes on the battlefield, ISW say. And bringing us bang up to date today, just in the last few hours, earlier this morning, Prime Minister Donald Tusk of Poland said this morning that an explosion that damaged a Polish railway track on a route to Ukraine was a, quote, unprecedented act of sabotage. Writing on X, Donald Tusk said the blowing up of the railway track on the Warsaw to Lublin route is an unprecedented act of sabotage aimed at the security of the Polish state and its citizens. An investigation is underway. Just like in previous cases of this kind, we will catch the perpetrators regardless who their backers are. Now, it comes just as Polish radio station RMF24 reporting this morning that a very senior Polish general had said, while speaking about that attack, you may remember, on the night of September 9th to the 10th, when Polish airspace was violated by Russian drones, he said the threat was more serious than earlier reported because some of those objects carried explosives. So General Cliche said the narrative that these were cardboard and paper objects is not entirely true. You'll remember 23 drones had violated Polish airspace that night. Some were destroyed in Polish territory, others broke up in the air. And then early this morning, just to lead into France's, President Zelensky, he's had a whirlwind tour of a few European countries over the weekend, but he arrived in France earlier today, immediately went and signed an order with President Macron for Ukraine to buy 100 Rafale jets, I think by 2035. Also, there was air defence systems, radars, missiles, and a whole package. Ukraine and France signing a not quite a bilateral deal or an agreement like Ukraine has with Britain, the sort of 100-year partnership, for what that means. But this is to deepen defence industrial relations between Ukraine and France. He was then said to go and visit the headquarters of the multinational force, the Coalition of the Willing. There's a headquarters that's very, very busy doing stuff. And they went to visit it. Who knew? Anyway, that's some military updates. Francis, what have you been looking at over the weekend?
Well, thanks, Tom. Who knew indeed? Yes. Well, President Trump likes to boast about striking deals, but it's been President Zelensky who's been busy on that score the past few days. As you say, that French deal is significant. By far the biggest Rafale aircraft order anywhere outside of France. What isn't clear is how it fits in with the Gripen fighters order already made by the Ukrainians with the Swedes. Nor is the question of timescale. Is this as much a symbolic deal as a practical military one? Equally as important, I'd wager, is the air defence components of this deal, which includes additional SAMP-T systems and Aster-30 missiles, especially vital this winter as Putin seeks to once again destroy Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Hence, the other deal of the weekend of significance, the one we signposted on Friday with the Greeks. Kyiv confirms that gas supplies from Greece will begin in January being funnelled to Ukraine, receiving not only natural gas, but also obtaining energy from the US through their infrastructure. Now, next up on Zelensky's grand tour is Madrid, Spain. We understand he'll hold talks with Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez and King Felipe VI tomorrow, with the priority, once again, being air defence systems and missiles. As we've talked about before, the Spanish have been given special permission by NATO not to hit the new minimal defence spending target, and by Some are considered a weaker partner in the alliance. This will be Zelensky's third visit there since the full-scale invasion. And it comes after a concerning report in Reuters citing Ukrainian intelligence fears that Moscow plans to manufacture up to 120,000 glide bombs this year. Also in that report is an interesting detail on the latest regarding the North Korean ammunition deliveries. Kyiv argues that the shipment of millions of rounds of artillery shells from Pyongyang that helped Russia keep up its rates of fire on the battlefield in 2024 and partially this year have more than halved in the last 12 months after stocks ran low. Furthermore, they claim there were no shell deliveries recorded from North Korea at all in September, but some were recorded in October, and that about half the shells supplied by Pyongyang were so old they needed to go to plants in Russia to be improved. Now, we can't, of course, independently verify those numbers, but we have seen Russia seek to produce more of its ammunition and weapons domestically rather than rely on global supply chains. The claim by Kyiv's military intelligence that Russia plans to import 12,000 North Korean workers to make its drones by the end of the year would speak to a sweet spot for the Kremlin, utilising cheap foreign labour and foreign-built components, but at home. Now, just as a side tangent, I saw a small but revealing story a few weeks ago that North Korea built a museum glorifying its troops fighting against Ukraine, which Kim Jong-un himself attended at the launch, dedicated, as were reports, to those who performed the brilliant military exploits and services in the military operations to liberate the Kursk region of the fraternal Russian Federation at the cost of their blood and lives. Now that underscores that this was not a secret operation. It was and is a huge part of the North Korean strategy to foster stronger ties with Moscow and the enemies of the United States. And it is a relationship that is being bolstered. There is evidence now that North Korean forces are not just in Kursk, within Russia's border, but have seemingly been deployed in Ukraine in order to help clear mines from the battlefield. And this isn't from some clandestine source. It comes from our old friend Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman. He said Moscow is grateful to our friends in North Korea for their selfless, heroic assistance. And then the Russian Defense Ministry published videos of North Korean troops being shown different types of mines and detection equipment, participating in training exercises and singing some patriotic songs. Apparently, they're clearing mines in the Kursk region, right on the border, and just north of Kharkiv. Now, if that is true, that would be clear evidence of forces being deployed by a foreign power for Russia in Ukraine, even in an accessory role. So what difference is there between that and, hypothetically, European military trainers being deployed in the west of Ukraine? Once again, we see a double standard here, with Western calculations not wanting to risk escalation by not publicly putting any kinds of troops on the ground in Ukraine, on the understanding, perhaps, that Russia won't either, when in fact it seems there is evidence that they already have. So the hesitation on the part of Europe especially is extraordinary, and that's something that was observed by the Finnish President Alexander Stubb in a recent interview. He said, and I quote, "In World War II, Stalin was in Berlin in 4 years. We're almost 4 years into this war, and Russia is nowhere near Kyiv, and they're not going to get there. However," he said, "I'm not very optimistic about achieving a ceasefire or the beginning of peace negotiations this year. Thus, we must put more pressure on Moscow now." But further to the EU's decision on utilising the frozen Russian assets being delayed until mid-December, we also have uncertainty over Czechia's ammunition initiative, with its new government coalition likely to take office in the coming weeks, still not making its position clear on the matter. Now, I know you've been looking into this more deeply, Dom. We're going to run an interview on it later this week. I just wondered if you wanted to trail a little bit of that.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. So last week I interviewed Jan Lipavsky. He's the outgoing Foreign Minister of Czechia, the Czech Republic. Outgoing because, as you say, he lost the election last month. It was won by Andrej Babiš, who's a billionaire businessman. Babiš is going to have to rely on the far-right SPD. That's a party that is very anti-NATO, anti-EU. They want a referendum on Czechia leaving the European Union. Babiš is also going to have to rely on the fairly single-issue party, see if you can guess, the party that's called Motorists for Themselves. Anyway, they've got some good numbers, so Mr. Babiš is relying on them to shore up his coalition. Now, Babiš did campaign, and one of the things he campaigned under, the slogan, was that he was going to halt the Czech ammunition initiative. You'll remember that there's a number of capability coalitions. I think there's 8: tanks, air defence, drones, artillery, etc., etc. So Czechia is leading on that. They're not only producing a whole load, but they do a lot on kind of corralling European efforts to build more for this overall ammunition initiative. And therefore, I asked Mr. Lipavsky if it would survive a change of administration. He said that if Mr. Babiš stops it, that would be a huge blow to the international reputation of the Czech Republic and would be a gift to Putin. He said that even under a Babiš prime ministership, Czechia will still be able to sell ammunition to Ukraine, but what could be lost is that wider administration, as I was talking about, the kind of administration of the whole coalition, the benefits derived from coordinating the efforts of various Czech institutions, the MOD, with business, with industry, etc., fundraising, international diplomacy, so on and so forth. So it would not stop potentially the direct sale of ammunition, but it certainly wouldn't be a good idea, a good development for Ukraine, and it could be very serious indeed. But we will continue to keep our eye on that. And I think we're going to have put the interview out sometime this week.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Don. Well, just since we're in that part of Central Europe, extraordinary scenes were recorded of students walking out of a meeting with Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico after he criticised the EU's support for Ukraine. When they defended the need to aid Ukraine's existential defence, Fico told them that they should go and fight there instead, causing the young people to walk out with one of them waving the Ukrainian flag. Slovakia, as we all know, is still a major barrier to action within the EU, as is Hungary. And the latest from Budapest is that Viktor Orbán seeks to take the EU to court over its decision to ban Russian gas imports. His foreign minister has also decided to provide 1.5 million euros to Lebanon instead of Ukraine, saying, and I quote, "The national interests of Hungary are peace in the Middle East. We will not spend our share of the European peace facility on arming Ukraine, but will direct money to support the Lebanese armed forces." You can almost sense their sense of relish in doing that, knowing the anger it'll stoke inside Brussels and elsewhere. But I'll end my segment today, in light of our interview, with an interesting long read in The Guardian about how Britain remains the villain of choice in Moscow's propaganda. As its authors write, the EUK has been accused of plotting drone strikes on Russian airfields, blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, directing terrorist raids inside Russia, and even abetting last year's gruesome Islamic State concert attack in Moscow. This week, a new charge was added to the pile. Russian authorities claimed British intelligence had tried and failed to lure Russian pilots into defecting to the West. And the piece then goes on to quote Sergei Lavrov, who said this: "The FSB exposed all of this in great detail." He then went on to describe this British-backed plot to lure a Russian pilot flying a missile-equipped jet to Romania, where it would be shot down by NATO forces. "I don't know how the British will wash themselves clean of it," Lavrov said, although their ability to play the role of goose coming out of the shower is well known.
Paging Dr. Freud.
Now, if you haven't a clue what he's talking about there, to play the role of goose coming out of the shower is a Russian idiom that describes someone or something as somehow always emerging spotless despite its actions. What's less clear is if it refers to a rain shower or a bathroom shower. I sincerely hope it's the latter, but I think that's a phrase we might need to use on the podcast. Don, we've had a few narrow escapes over the years, haven't we?
I thought it was a Top Gun reference. I was racking my brains to see if Goose was coming out of the shower. I mean,
is that a scene in it?
Well,
I think you might have imagined that one, Don, one of your fantasies.
Well, as I said, paging Dr. Freud. And now to our interview with a name that will be familiar to many of you. Vladimir Kara-Murza is a Russian-British political activist, historian and journalist known for his pro-democracy work. A former vice-chair of the organisation Open Russia, he was arrested in 2022 after denouncing Russia's invasion of Ukraine, later charged with treason and sentenced to 25 years in a Siberian penal colony. He received several international awards during his imprisonment, including the Václav Havel Human Rights Prize and the Pulitzer Prize in 2024 for his pieces written from prison for The Washington Post. He was released on August 1st, 2024, in the prominent multinational prisoner exchange we covered at the time. In this wide-ranging interview with the Telegraph's Europe editor James Crisp, he talks about conditions in prison, what it takes to survive, and the suppressive measures of Putin's regime. He also discusses his view on the war in Ukraine, what more needs to be done to support the country, and his perspective on the Alaska summit between Trump and Putin. This is their conversation.
Mr. Kara-Murza, it's a little over a year since you were released from Putin's prison. You were poisoned twice. How is your health now, may I ask?
Well, it's as good as it can be because, frankly, I was saved last year by this concerted effort of several Western democracies coming together to negotiate this prisoner exchange with the Putin regime. But while 16 of us were saved from the hell that is Putin's modern-day gulag in that exchange in August of 2024, hundreds upon hundreds of Russian political prisoners remain behind. And so for many of these political prisoners, for people like Alexei Gorinov, for people like Maria Ponomarenko and many others who are sitting in the Russian gulag because they've spoken out against the war in Ukraine, well, I'll be completely blunt about it. Many of them are dying. For so many of them, this is a question of life or death. And this is why I'm here, because we desperately need for these international prisoner exchanges to continue. Because for so many of my fellow Russian citizens who are trapped in Putin's gulag simply for speaking their mind, simply for speaking the truth, we don't know how much time they have. And I hope the British government will be a part of this process.
Can you give our listeners and our readers a sense of how it felt the moment you were given a 25-year sentence, knowing that would mean solitary confinement in such horrific conditions?
Well, frankly speaking, my first thought was, a job well done on my part, because it's just yet more proof that what we are doing is actually effective. And every time, another opponent of the Kremlin is sent away to prison, that's just one more proof of how afraid the Putin regime really is of facing anything approaching real political competition. The sentence I received, 25 years, was the longest prison sentence for any political prisoner in our country since the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953. 25, wow, that was a really high mark of recognition for all my work.
Did you think it was a death sentence?
Of course, absolutely. I was absolutely certain that I was going to die in that Siberian prison. When I was transferred from Moscow from my pre-trial detention center to the Siberian Gulag, this was in September of 2023, the chief medical officer at my Moscow prison, he was a decent guy, said to me quite honestly, you have about a year and a half once you get there, because I've survived 2 assassination attempts with a nerve agent by the FSB. And still to this day, I sometimes pinch myself, because the only way I can describe the prisoner exchange that took place in August of 2024 is that it was a miracle. It was made possible by so many good people in democratic nations who never stopped speaking out, advocating, shouting on behalf of all of those people in Russia, imprisoned in Putin's jails, for speaking out against Putin's dictatorship and for calling out his murderous war in Ukraine.
I mean, you said earlier you were allowed one book in solitary confinement. I have to ask, what was the book?
Once I got to Omsk, which was in the autumn of 2023, I was constantly held in solitary confinement. As the chief security officer of the prison told me, you do realize we will never let you out into the general prisoner population. You will infect people with your views. This is the way that political prisoners in our country, whom the regime considers to be, quote-unquote, particularly dangerous, have been treated for decades since Soviet times, always isolated, always alone, always in solitary confinement. So all the time that I spent in Siberia, I spent in solitary confinement, and it was 3 by 4 meters, 4 walls, a small metal barred window under the ceiling. You're only allowed to write for an hour and a half every day. The guards bring you pen and paper, then take it away again. And for the rest of the day, all you can do is just walk around aimlessly in small circles. There's nothing to do, there's nowhere to go, and worst of all, there's no one to speak to. There's a reason why, according to the United Nations minimal standard rules on the treatment of prisoners, prolonged solitary confinement is equated to torture, because once a human being is just totally deprived of any human contact, well, they start going crazy. But I at least had the benefit of having read about and learned about the experience of Soviet dissidents. And so each one of them had their own way of keeping their sanity in these conditions. Right? So Vladimir Bukovsky would build imaginary castles in his head. Natan Sharansky, who was a brilliant chess player as well as an accomplished mathematician, would play mental chess matches against himself inside his head. He later wrote that the good news was whatever happened, he would always win. And so I managed to get myself a Spanish textbook. And I was just sitting there from morning till night, just learning and so on, as a way to channel my mental energy into something constructive. One of the most horrible feelings in prison is the feeling of the time of your life just meaninglessly going past you. Day after day, week after week, month after month, and you just sit there in a tiny cell and doing nothing. But every night when I went to sleep, I was able to tell myself, I have actually done something useful with this day. And I thought that in the worst case scenario, if I did go crazy, then I would at least be able to shout at my prison guards in a perfect Castilian dialect. And made a mental note that even the most horrible time in your life, the time spent in solitary confinement in a Siberian gulag, can be used for something practical.
I mean, obviously it's quite clear your human rights were impacted, were infringed. I mean, what do you think about the UK debate about leaving the European Convention on Human Rights? Russia left the Council of Europe.
I'll give you a very blunt answer. I think it is shameful and unacceptable. In a 75-year history now of the Council of Europe and of the European Convention on Human Rights, only 2 countries were ever expelled from it. The first was Greece in the 1960s when there was a military dictatorship in Greece. And then once democracy was restored, it was readmitted back into the Council of Europe and under the umbrella of the European Convention on Human Rights. And the second country, of course, was Russia. After Putin invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, by unanimous decision of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the Russian Federation was excluded from that organization and ceased to be a state party to the European Convention on Human Rights. And again, I have absolutely no doubt that a different Russia after Vladimir Putin, a democratic Russia, will one day rejoin the Council of Europe and once again re-sign and re-ratify the European Convention on Human Rights. I'm biased in this question, if I may say so, because to me, one other thing that allowed me to survive in prison were the letters I was getting from all over Russia, from all over the world. And that is really a lifeline for a political prisoner, especially somebody who is kept in solitary confinement. But the only reason I was able to have letters and I was able to have lawyers is because when Russia joined the Council of Europe and became a state party to the European Convention on Human Rights back in the 1990s, that membership came with certain conditions. For example, transferring the prison system from under the security services to civilian control, the Ministry of Justice. And that came with things like the right to correspondence and the right to lawyer visits. Now Russia is no longer under the European Convention on Human Rights. And so from the 1st of January of next year, 2026, prisoners will lose a lot of those small rights that we have. And I'm also biased because for many, many years, the closest place for a Russian citizen like me to get real justice was Strasbourg, the seat of the European Court of Human Rights. I alone won 3 cases at the European Court of Human Rights against the Putin government. The European Convention on Human Rights is an absolutely unique and essential foundation of the international rules-based order as you know it. And of course the United Kingdom stood at the very heart of this movement, and I believe it is absolutely unacceptable for the United Kingdom, a country with an established democracy, with an established system of the rule of law, to be breaking its links with this venerable pan-European charter that protects the human rights and freedoms of so many people, including of people in this country.
I'd like to talk to you a bit about Ukraine. I mean, what is your view at the moment, from your sort of unique standpoint, on the war in Ukraine? How do things stand? What do you think about it?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to state that in a most important way, Vladimir Putin has lost the war in Ukraine. He's lost it really by the end of February, the beginning of March of 2022. Because let's not forget the original goal that Putin and the Kremlin had when they attacked Kiev in 3 days. The goal of Vladimir Putin was the destruction of Ukraine as a sovereign, independent, democratic state. Yet here we are speaking with you in November of 2025, and Ukraine is still standing. And the overarching goal of Putin, to destroy the Ukrainian nation, which he pretends does not even exist, well, we've seen that this narrative has been resoundingly defeated, and I think this is testimony to the strength, the resilience, and the national mobilization that the Ukrainian nation has showed over these 3.5+ years of war against a much larger and more powerful country. And I think this is an absolutely amazing achievement for the people of Ukraine.
Can you see this war ending anytime soon? Can it end when Putin is in power? He's never going to give up power when he's still alive, is he?
First of all, and I say this most sincerely, I wish Vladimir Putin a long life and very good health, because I want him to spend as many years in prison as possible to be held accountable for all the horrendous crimes he has committed over his years in power against our own citizens in Russia, for everything he has done to people in other countries, in Georgia, in Syria, where Putin's army also committed war crimes, in Ukraine since 2014, and again with a full-scale invasion since February of 2022, when we're seeing hospitals bombed and schools bombed and children being killed and whole cities being wiped from the face of the earth. I want Putin to be held accountable for that. I want to see his face when he's sitting in that dock, just like Slobodan Milosevic, the former Serbian dictator, did in The Hague. But the answer to your previous question is very simple. No, this war will not end for as long as Vladimir Putin remains in power. There will not be peace for Ukraine. There will not be peace in Europe. And there is 25 years of track record to prove it. For a quarter of a century, this man has continued to kill, both inside and outside Russia's borders. When it comes to Russia, internal repression and external aggression are always two sides of the same coin. A government that does not respect the rights and freedoms of its own people will not respect the borders of its neighbors. So the only way to achieve and guarantee long-term peace, stability and security, not just for Ukraine but for the whole of Europe, is to have a democratic system of government in Russia, a government that would respect the rights and freedoms of our own people and that would abide by the civilized norms of international law.
So, I mean, do you see any sign of Putin's regime tottering? We've seen some protests, but we're not seeing a great groundswell of popular discontent like maybe we saw in Romania against Ceausescu, or similar popular uprisings. How long can he last?
It's funny you refer to Ceausescu. A good friend of mine, Boris Wisniewski, who's a long-time member of the Legislative Assembly in St. Petersburg, deputy leader of Yabloko, which is the last remaining opposition party in Russia, was speaking to a journalist, and they asked him, why is Putin so seemingly popular among Russian citizens? And then he looked at the journalist and he said, well, you know what, Ceausescu had 99% approval in the polls 2 weeks before he was overthrown. When it comes to Russia, major political change in Russia always happens like this. A snap of a finger, suddenly, swiftly, completely unexpectedly. Both the Tsarist regime at the beginning of the 20th century and the communist regime at the end of the 20th century collapsed in 3 days, and nobody saw it coming. Václav Havel wrote about this phenomenon in his seminal work, The Power of the Powerless, which I read, by the way, in my Siberian prison cells. He writes, how can we assess the state of public opinion in a country that imprisons people for expressing their opinion? This is not possible. And so the next time there's major political change in Russia, it will be exactly in the same way. None of us will know even a week before. The Putin regime will seem strong, stable, and secure, and then it will be gone. And the key thing here, the most important thing that we can be doing now, is to be preparing for that day after Putin, so that neither we in Russia nor you in the West repeat the mistakes that were committed back in the 1990s that led us to where we are today. And it is in the interest of everybody to make sure that the next time Russia gets a chance, a window of opportunity for democratic change, that it succeeds.
The latest person who has been arrested, I believe, is the deputy political leader of Yabloko.
Maxim Kruglov, right.
What did you think when you heard that he'd been arrested?
Not a day goes by without the news of another arrest, another indictment, another sham trial of somebody on politically motivated charges. Today's Russia holds more political prisoners than the whole of the USSR did in the mid-1980s. According to Memorial, Russia's most respected human rights organization, co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, there are more than 4,500 people in Russian prisons who are there on politically motivated charges. Every day on average, 5 more people are arrested in Russia on politically motivated charges. But of course, the emotional impact is all the greater when this concerns somebody that I know personally. Maxim Kruglov is a personal friend of mine. He did everything he could to help me when I was in prison. He was a member of the Moscow City Council for 5 years. He's the deputy leader of Yabloko, the last remaining opposition party in Russia. The day I was arrested, that first evening, that first night, he held a vigil outside the police station in Moscow where I was being held. He would try to come to every single one of my court hearings. Nobody was allowed to come in, but I knew that he was there along with other friends and colleagues standing in the corridor. Every time the prison authorities in Omsk found another way to make my conditions more unbearable. Maxim would bombard the authorities there with protests and official, letters. Now, of course, practically this couldn't result in anything. But it is so important for a political prisoner to know that they're not forgotten, that people care. Now it is he who needs our help. He's, as you know, currently facing up to 10 years in prison on quote-unquote charges of posting on social media denouncing the war crimes that the Russian army has committed in Ukraine. This is the Orwellian reality of today's Russia. It's not the people who are committing war crimes who are being held accountable. It's the people who are denouncing those war crimes who are being kept in prison. And I know from personal experience how important it is to have that solidarity and that public advocacy and to shine that spotlight here in democratic countries on all those people who are unjustly and unlawfully imprisoned in Putin's Russia and other dictatorships around the world. James McCleary, a Liberal Democrat MP, who is on the British delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, stood up the same day that Maxim Kruglov was arrested. It was the plenary session of the Assembly was going on in Strasbourg, and he talked about Maxim and he talked about his case. And we need to talk about this every single day, because the only way we can help these political prisoners is by making sure that they're not forgotten. And I do believe that the democratic world has a moral obligation to stand in solidarity with those people, not just in words, but also in actions.
One of the things that we've noticed is that Putin has also begun jailing pro-war bloggers who were given a certain amount of license to criticize the Russian military. But that seems to be a crackdown. I think one guy's called Sergei Markov, another called Roman Elikin. I mean, why?
Yeah, they're not jailed, they're declared foreign agents. But you're right in the sense that this was only done to political opponents before. Now they're starting to do it to their own people.
Why do you think that is?
Oh, this is the logic of any repressive regime. I mean, look back at the Soviet Union under Stalin in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. First they went after their political opponents and their political adversaries and their political enemies, and then the system began to devour, its own people, itself, exactly. And this is, by the way, something that many of my friends and colleagues in the Russian opposition have been trying to convey to people who are Putin supporters. If you think it's not going to affect you, you're wrong, it will. Once they finish with all of us, they're going to start going after you, because once this machinery of repression starts, it cannot stop until the dictatorship crumbles and falls, which will happen, of course, one day.
And what do you think about Trump's treatment of Putin in the negotiations, for peace negotiations?
It was absolutely shocking to me, frankly speaking, to watch those images coming out of Anchorage, Alaska in August of this year, when you had a mass murderer, a usurper, an indicted war criminal with an active arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court, which is what Vladimir Putin is, being greeted by the President of the United States on American territory and given red carpet treatment with a military band and so on. This is the continuation, I'm afraid, of a long and shameful policy of appeasement that so many Western governments have conducted towards the regime of Vladimir Putin, frankly, for the whole 25 years that has been in power. We saw, one American president, George W. Bush, look into Putin's eyes and see his soul. Another American president, Barack Obama, push a reset button with Putin. We remember one German chancellor by the name of Gerhard Schröder literally selling himself to Vladimir Putin in the most direct sense of this term. But, I'll never forget, many years ago, working as a journalist here in London, I was covering Vladimir Putin's state visit to the UK in June of 2003. And it was absolutely mind-boggling to see the lavish reception that Putin was getting here, literally 2 days after his government pulled the plug on the last independent television channel in Russia. Basically, the West doesn't care. As long as there are lucrative deals, as long as, they can find some sort of modus operandi on the international stage, they don't care about what's happening inside Russia. And this policy of appeasement is in large way responsible for where we are today, including with the war in Ukraine. I mean, you would think that after 3.5 years of the largest military conflict in Europe since the end of World War II, which is what Putin has been doing in Ukraine, you would see at least that would put some sense back into Western leaders, but apparently not. And if there is one clear lesson from 20th century history, is that the appeasement of dictators never leads to actual peace. It only leads to more war, more suffering, more blood.
I mean, Europe is counting, I think, on the penny sort of dropping with Trump, that he'll realise that Putin is tapping him along in these peace negotiations. In the meantime, they'll say, yes, we'll do this, we'll do that. Do you think there's any chance of Trump ever getting properly tough with Putin? And what's Europe doing wrong? It should be an important player in this, but it's been relegated to a bystander.
Well, first of all, for all the criticism of European policy, it's much better than the policy of the current US administration. I mean, at least most European countries are still standing behind Ukraine, which is not what can be said about the current leadership in the White House. And frankly, Trump would love to have the power that Putin has. He would love to have no independent media, no free elections, no rule of law system, no judiciary independent of the state, and so on. And so no, I do not expect any significant shift from the current American administration when it comes to Vladimir Putin. And it's really up to Europe now to step up and claim that title of the leader of the free world that once belonged to America, but the one that I don't think America has any right to now that Donald Trump is in power.
There's been a lot of sanctions, both at European level and it's been coordinated with Britain, and those sanctions have been agreed when in the past they haven't been agreed. But they haven't worked to the extent of bringing down Putin's regime or forcing him to the negotiating table. Why haven't the sanctions worked?
Two answers to this. One is that those sanctions that need to be put in place are implemented very inadequately. There are glaring loopholes in those sanctions mechanisms. One of the first sanctions measures that were introduced were against any military or dual-use technology finding its way to Russia. But if you open a recent report by RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, you'll find that up to 30% of all the military equipment and technologies used by Putin's army in Ukraine still comes from Western aligned sources. And this is absolutely unacceptable now that we're in a fourth year of this full-scale invasion. And the other example, of course, is the targeted personal sanctions. We still hear from time to time these mind-boggling stories of people from Putin's close entourage and their family members still freely traveling around Western countries, European Union countries. And only recently there were news stories that the son of Valentina Matviyenko, who is a speaker of the so-called upper house of parliament, who actually authorized the invasion of Ukraine, her son is happily living in Italy. There were stories of Putin's niece by the name of Tsivileva, who is the Deputy Minister of Defense of Russia. She was freely traveling very recently throughout the European Union. How are stories like this possible? This is one side of the equation. The other side, some of the sanctions that are introduced by Western countries are actually very counterproductive. And probably the most vivid example of this is the approach by some countries on the eastern flank of the European Union to impose blanket indiscriminatory sanctions against all Russian citizens. Nothing could be a bigger gift to Putin's propaganda. Because for years and years, the Kremlin regime tried to convince Russian citizens that the West is against them. And any time another country on the eastern flank of the EU would do something like this, all Putin's propaganda needed to do is just to amplify that and say, we told you, they're all Russophobes, they hate all of you. Not to mention the fact that, sanctions should be directed against people who deserve them, to the people who are responsible for the war in Ukraine, for people who are responsible for the human rights abuses, people who are responsible in corruption. I do not think it is acceptable in the 21st century to discriminate against someone simply because of the color of their passport.
Is Russia's opposition united enough? Because there are divides and tensions among those parties, which helps Putin.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure the term opposition even applies. There cannot be an opposition in a totalitarian dictatorship. People who oppose the regime in my country are either dead, like Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny, because they've been murdered by Putin, or they are imprisoned, or they are in forced exile. And so perhaps the term dissidence or resistance would be more appropriate than opposition. But to the substance of your question, there are too many internal arguments and squabbles and bickerings among different groups, of the anti-Putin resistance of the democratic movement in Russia. And as a point of principle, I have never participated in these squabbles and bickerings and arguments because I believe this is very short-sighted, damaging, and very irresponsible. My enemy is in the Kremlin. And so I think, for now, the most important, the overarching consideration is to forget all those differences and work together to bring forward the day when Russia is finally free of this dictatorial repressive regime and when Europe can finally become whole, free, and at peace, because the only way that's ever going to happen is with a democratic Russia.
Final question, you are a historian. Is there a historical figure you would compare Putin to?
I have absolutely no doubt that in future history books, Vladimir Putin will be put in the same category, in the same level as Adolf Hitler, as Joseph Stalin, as Pol Pot, as Mao Zedong, as the worst mass murderers known to mankind.
OK, let's go to final thoughts. I will kick off, if I may. Now, a large factory in Chester County, just west of Philadelphia, that makes munitions for the military, suffered a catastrophic fire last week. This is the Action Manufacturing Company, makes fuses, electronic devices, custom energetics, according to the Chester County Department of Emergency Services. Went up in smoke last Tuesday. The Chester County hazmat team also responded to the scene and decided the safest course of action was to monitor the fire until it burned out on its own. No reports of any casualties, but keen if anybody has got an update on it or know of anything suspicious about it. We have reported about these blasts across Europe. There was also where was that other blast in the US, ammunition factory that suffered a catastrophic blast, and I think people were killed in that one. Anyway, if you know anything about this one in Chester County, please do get in touch, and thanks to Andy in Oregon for pointing me towards that story. Francis, what do you got for final thoughts?
Thanks, Dom. On Monday the 3rd episode, we had Jens Stoltenberg on, and I was interviewing him off the back of a new Norwegian documentary film that follows him around in the last 2 years of his tenure as NATO Secretary General. A really, really fascinating documentary, and it features quite a few interjections from journalists, including Dom and myself, as well as Joe Barnes and David Nicholls, providing historical context for the events that are unfolding on screen. I know many of you have asked how you can watch that, and for those of you who are in London, if you go to Bertha Dock House at the Brunswick Centre in Bloomsbury, then there are screenings all of this week. And I know that there are plans for other screenings around Europe and around the world more widely, but for now, if you're in London, I just thought I would flag that one. A really compelling piece of cinema and provides insights on what was going on in the thought processes of key leaders at critical moments of the war.
Nice little theatre that, the Kurz and Bloomsbury. That's where Ukrainian Action have done a few bits and pieces. We've been there with them. So yeah, do go along and check that out if you can, folks, at the Brunswick Centre. That weird sort of 1970s / space 1999 place in North London. But it's great cinema. OK, that's us for the day today, folks. We will be back again, same time, same place, 1 o'clock London time tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone. I know what Dom will be doing this evening. Putting on Top Gun.
I will. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons, to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.